Hi, I'm Alina, 34. On Christmas Eve, I placed 14 gift-wrapped evidence binders beside my husband, then vanished. 1 week later, on New Year's morning, divorce papers detonated his world. The air inside our Brooklyn brownstone was thick with the scent of pine and roast turkey drifting from the neighbor's apartment. Outside, snow drifted softly, muffling the street in white silence. He looked at the festive pile on the ottoman, a confused smile creeping across his face. He thought they were presents. In a way, they were the gift of truth. I just stood there, holding my breath and my car keys, watching the last few seconds of our marriage tick away. How does a love that once felt indestructible collapse into a war of paper and ink? How does a decade of promises end with a stack of printed-out lies? Before the silence, there was life. A good life. A life built on small, sacred rituals. I remember our 8th anniversary. We drove out to Montauk, the sky that perfect, aching blue it only gets in late September. He had a surprise for me. A small, heavy box wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was a 1940s fountain pen, its body a deep, marbled green. He knew my obsession. He told me he wanted me to design beautiful things with it for the next 50 years. We walked on the beach, our hands intertwined, and I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost terrifying. I felt known. My life was measured in those moments and in blueprints and ink. I'm an architect, the kind who still uses vintage pens. My thumbs are permanently stained a shade of blue-black, a map of all the structures I've dreamed into existence. There were other moments, too. Quiet ones. I'd fall asleep at my drafting table, my cheek pressed against a half-finished floor plan, and he'd find me there at 2 in the morning. He would gently scoop me up, my head lolling against his shoulder, and carry me to bed without a word. Those gestures felt more real than any grand declaration. They were the load-bearing walls of our love. Or so I thought. My days were for buildings, my weekends for bodies. I taught Krav Maga, a fierce and practical art of self-defense. It was my balance. The squeak of my knee brace on the studio stairs was a constant companion, a souvenir from a training injury years ago. It was a low-grade, manageable pain I had simply absorbed into my life. I thought our marriage was like that too. Solid, with a few familiar aches you learn to live with. I freeze. Because right then, I believed that love was about absorbing the pain, not questioning its source. The COVID lockdowns had changed things, of course. He was a resident, pulling impossible frontline shifts. The brownstone grew quiet, our conversations shrinking to tired pleasantries. He'd come home hollow-eyed, and I would try to fill the space between us with good food and quiet support. But the space just kept getting bigger. I told myself it was the stress, the state of the world. I told myself the growing distance was a temporary casualty of a global crisis. We would find our way back. I was sure of it. Then the micro-red flags started, tiny cuts in the fabric of our life. One night, he canceled our dinner plans via text. Swamped at the hospital. Grabbed something without me. An hour later, I saw a charge alert from our joint account. A restaurant. A fancy one downtown, the kind with 2 top tables and low lighting. When I asked him about it the next day, he waved it off. Oh, a few of us grabbed a bite to celebrate a patient's recovery. It was a whole thing. Forgot to mention it. He was a bad liar. His eyes flickered away for just a second too long. But I wanted to believe him. Believing him was easier than the alternative. I freeze. Because right then, the truth felt like a threat to my own survival. Another time, he was on the phone in the study, his back to me. His voice was low, intimate. When he saw me in the doorway, he straightened up, his tone immediately shifting to something clipped and professional. Yeah, I'll look over the charts. Talk tomorrow. He hung up. Work, he said, walking past me without making eye contact. But the warmth in his voice before he saw me, that wasn't work. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, but I swallowed it down. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation was getting to me. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday. He came home late, exhausted. He said he'd been out for staff drinks, a much-needed release with his team. But when he leaned in to kiss me, the smell was wrong. It wasn't the beery, crowded bar smell I expected. It was shower steam. And soap. A cheap, floral, antiseptic soap. The kind you find bolted to the wall in a motel bathroom. It was so specific, so out of place, that it felt louder than a scream. I said nothing. I just stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs, and smiled. I filed it away, a tiny shard of glass in the soft tissue of my trust. A week later, another shard joined it. Then another. And I knew. I just knew. Doubt is a patient predator. Once it has your scent, it follows you everywhere. It moved into our home and sat between us on the sofa. It started with his phone. It used to be a part of the household landscape, left on the kitchen island or the nightstand, screen up, indifferent. Then it became a guarded object, a black mirror reflecting a life I wasn't allowed to see. The moment I entered a room, he'd flip it over, a gesture as quick and unconscious as a flinch. One evening, I was reading on the couch, and he was scrolling through something, a small smile on his face. I asked him what was funny. Nothing, he said, his thumb immediately locking the screen. Just a stupid meme. The smile was gone. The air grew cold. I freeze. Because right then, the silence in our home had developed a weight, an actual physical presence. The gentle buzz of a text message, once a benign sound, started to feel like a threat. My heart would seize every time. Who was on the other end of that vibration? What world was he living in when he looked at that screen? He started missing dinners I'd cooked. One Friday, I made his favorite, braised short ribs, a dish that took all afternoon. He was supposed to be home by 7. At 8, he texted. So sorry. Got held up. No explanation. I stood in the kitchen, the rich aroma filling the empty room. I carefully packed the entire meal into containers and put them in the fridge. I didn't get angry. I just felt erased. He started having more and more late nights at the hospital. I felt myself shrinking, trying to take up less space, as if my presence was an inconvenience to the secret life he was building. I felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of my own marriage. I hated myself for the suspicion that was poisoning me from the inside out, but the not knowing was a worse poison. It was a slow-acting acid, dissolving everything I thought was real. The final piece of the puzzle came from the most mundane place imaginable, our network printer. I was looking for an old invoice for a client, scrolling through the print history log. And there they were. Hotel confirmations. Not for work trips we'd discussed. Not for vacations we had planned. Just dates. Tuesdays. Thursdays. Afternoons booked at cheap hotels a few miles from the hospital where he was supposed to be saving lives. What other ghosts were hiding in the digital feed of our life? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. The foundation of my world wasn't just cracked. It was hollow. I freeze. Because right then I knew I had to see the truth, no matter how much it burned me to the ground. I thought about my childhood. It's funny how the ghosts of your parents' marriage come to haunt your own. My parents' marriage was a battlefield. Their fights were loud, operatic things that shook the walls. Plates were thrown. Doors were slammed. The screaming was a constant soundtrack to my youth. I have this one vivid memory of being 8 years old, huddled in my father's closet during one of their worst battles. I was hidden behind his heavy wool coats, breathing in the scent of cedar and mothballs, my small hands clamped over my ears. I could still hear them. Her accusations, his denials, the sound of something smashing. I remember promising the universe, promising myself that my life, my home, would be different. It would be quiet. It would be safe. I built my entire adult identity around that promise. I avoided conflict at all costs. I mistook the absence of fighting for the presence of peace. I see now that my fear of loud, messy confrontation was the reason I let the small, quiet betrayals slide for so long. Silence, even a dishonest one, felt safer than their truth. Acknowledging his lies would have meant a fight, a scene, a drama I was pathologically conditioned to avoid. It was easier to pretend I didn't see them than to face the storm. This deep-seated terror of a shouting match was my fatal flaw. That night, I did something I never thought I was capable of. I had installed a spy app on his phone a week earlier. An act of desperation that made me feel sick with shame. It pinged. A notification telling me his location. He was supposed to be on a double shift. He had kissed me goodbye that morning, his eyes full of feigned exhaustion, telling me not to wait up. But he wasn't at the hospital. He was at a Holiday Inn Express off the highway. From my laptop, in our living room, surrounded by a decade of our shared memories, photos from that trip to Montauk, the books we'd read together, the life we'd built, I connected to our printer. A convenience feature we'd set up ages ago. How beautifully, horribly convenient. I accessed his phone's photo gallery. I opened his text messages. And I hit print. I saw it all first. The green light of the inkjet printer blinking to life in the dark study, the stark white paper sliding into the feeder. It was a grotesque parody of my work, printing out blueprints of my own destruction. Then came the sound. The steady, relentless drone of the machine, a mechanical heartbeat in the silent house. Whir, slap. Whir, slap. Page after page, a torrent of betrayal in cyan, magenta, and yellow. It didn't stop for hours. The smell of hot plastic and ink filled the room, thick and chemical. I just sat there and listened to it work, a robotic accomplice to the death of my marriage. I freeze. Because right then, I felt a strange, chilling calm settle over me. The chaos was finally over. Now, there was only the evidence. I reached out and touched a sheet as it slid into the output tray. It was hot. The ink was still wet. My fingers came away stained. I held the proof in my hands. I saw the selfies she sent him, her face tilted in a way that was meant to be alluring. I read the sex they exchanged. "I can't stop thinking about you," one of his read. I felt a memory surface, hot and sharp. Him, whispering those exact same words to me years ago, his breath warm against my neck as we watched the sunset from our fire escape. The memory, once a treasure, instantly turned to ash in my mind. I read another message, one from her, our little secret. My mind flashed back to him carrying me to bed from my drafting table, our quiet, sacred ritual. Was she on his mind then? Was our entire life just a performance? My body reacted before my brain could. A wave of cold started in my chest and spread outwards, down my arms, into my fingertips, which suddenly felt numb. The room seemed to tilt. I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. The printer devoured $1,500 in ink and paper that night. It seemed a fair price for clarity. As the sun came up, I looked at the mountain of evidence on the floor. 14 inches high. And I knew exactly what I had to do. The enemy of infidelity is unpredictability. My entire life had been a reaction to the chaotic screaming of my parents. Now I would embrace a different kind of chaos, the cold, silent, strategic kind. My grief curdled into focus. I went into ghost mode. I bought a burner phone with cash. I set up a new email address. I found a small apartment to sublet from a friend of a friend, someone whose name he had never even heard. I started moving my most important things out of the house while he was at work, one box at a time. My fountain pens. My books. My portfolio. My knee brace, which I still wore out of habit, its familiar squeak a strangely comforting sound as I packed up my life. My inner flaw, my dread of conflict, was now my greatest weapon. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't cry. I would simply erase. I became an investigator. I spread our financial statements across my drafting table like blueprints. Late at night, with a single lamp cutting through the darkness, I would trace his lies. I used a ruler and a red pen to underline every suspicious charge, the flowers I never received, the dinners I wasn't invited to, the hotel rooms. I created a spreadsheet, a timeline of the affair, cross-referencing his hospital shifts with the hotel check-in times. It was a masterpiece of betrayal, precise and irrefutable. I'd play classical music, box cello suites, the mathematical precision of the notes calming the rage storming inside me. This cold, methodical work was my new self-defense. It was my Krav Maga for the soul. I freeze. Because right then I was living a double life, smiling politely at the man I shared a bed with, all while meticulously documenting his lies. I bought 14 simple black binders. I bought a 3-hole punch, and its metallic click-shunk became the percussive rhythm of my new reality. For weeks, every night after he fell asleep, I would sit at the kitchen table and assemble the evidence. The rustle of the heavy cardstock I'd chosen was the only sound. I organized everything chronologically, with tabs for each month. The private investigator I hired just confirmed what I already knew and gave me the last few pieces: her name, her address, her job, and her family. The soft rustle of the binder ribbons was a counterpoint to the silence. I had 14 different colors of ribbon, one for each recipient. His parents, my parents, his sister, our two closest couples, his mentor, his boss, and her mother, a devoutly Catholic woman prominent in her local church. That was the twist. The nuclear option. Was it worth the collateral damage? In those dark, quiet hours, fueled by coffee and a cold rage, the answer was yes. Absolutely yes. My new phone would buzz with updates. Every buzz was a confirmation. Every squeak of my knee brace as I paced the floor was a countdown. This wasn't just revenge. It was architecture. I was demolishing a condemned structure to make way for something new. Christmas Eve arrived, cold and clear. The city was sparkling. He came home with a bottle of champagne and a tired smile, talking about how we deserved a quiet holiday, just the two of us. He didn't notice the empty spaces on the bookshelves, or that my favorite coat was missing from the closet. He saw only what he wanted to see. I had the 14 binders stacked on the ottoman, each one wrapped in festive paper, topped with a glittering ribbon. They looked beautiful, like any other Christmas presents. He pointed at them, laughing. "What's all this? Did you buy out the entire store?" I didn't answer. I just looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in months. I saw a stranger. I calmly picked up the small duffel bag I'd packed with my essentials for the next few days. It was waiting by the door. "Alina? What's going on?" he asked, his smile finally faltering. I walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the cold night air. I didn't look back. I got in my car, turned off my old phone for the last time, and drove away. I didn't say a single word. His confusion, I imagined, would slowly turn to curiosity, then to dread when he decided to open his gift. I freeze. Because right then, my silence was the loudest sound in the world. The next week was lived in a strange, suspended reality. I stayed at my friend's place, an anonymous apartment high above the city. The binders were all shipped via courier, with delivery instructions for the morning of December 26th. I pictured them arriving, these heavy, innocuous packages. I imagined his mother opening hers. I imagined her mother untying a beautiful satin ribbon and finding a detailed account of her daughter's sins. The divorce papers were served to him at the brownstone on New Year's morning. He tried to call, of course. The voicemails started as angry, then moved to confused, then to pathetic, pleading sobs. I listened to the first one, then deleted the rest. The fallout was, as I'd planned, swift and total. Her company fired her. His hospital placed him on indefinite administrative leave. It was a clean sweep. The final meeting was at my new studio, a sunlit loft in a different borough. A space that smelled of sawdust and possibility. He looked smaller, diminished. He tried to apologize. The words sounded hollow, rehearsed. He slid a cashier's check across the smooth surface of my drafting table. The final settlement. He stared at me, his eyes searching for something, remorse, maybe. He found nothing. "Boundaries aren't for rent," I whispered. It was more for me than for him. I took the check, walked him to the door, and locked it behind him. "Thanks for staying with me. Have you ever seen karma land that fast? Healing is not a single event. It's a process, quiet and slow." For the first few weeks, I felt numb, operating on autopilot. Then, the grief hit me like a wave. Not for him, but for the future I thought I'd have. For the woman who walked on a beach in Montauk and believed in 50 years. I let myself feel it. I cried. I didn't answer my phone for days. I just sat with the emptiness. One afternoon, I tried to go to our old favorite coffee shop, thinking a small piece of routine would help. But the moment I walked in and smelled the familiar roasted beans, I had a full-blown panic attack. My chest tightened, I couldn't breathe. Some places are lost to you forever, tainted by the ghosts of a life that wasn't real. Then, one morning, I woke up and decided to live. It started with small things. I reconnected with another instructor from my Krav Maga studio, a woman named Sarah. We got coffee at a new place, and I told her a little of the story. She didn't offer pity. She just said, "Good. You defended yourself." It was exactly what I needed to hear. It started with my body too. One day, I was about to go for a run, and I reached for the knee brace out of habit. And I just stopped. My knee didn't hurt anymore. The constant, low-grade pain was gone. I had gotten stronger without even realizing it. I left the brace in the closet and never wore it again. It was a symbol. I was done with manageable pain. I freeze. Because right then I realized I was strong enough to stand on my own 2 feet, literally and figuratively. I started exploring, hiking trails upstate, finding solace in the sheer scale of the mountains. The physical exertion was a release, a way to burn off the residual anger. I adopted a dog from a local shelter, a scruffy mutt whose quiet companionship filled the empty spaces in my new apartment. I began to rebuild my identity outside of the we I had inhabited for so long. I wasn't his wife. I was just Alina, the architect, the instructor, the woman with ink on her thumbs. I thought about that cynical quote I'd once heard. For 23 years I thought she was mine. Turns out it was just my turn. It wasn't my story's timeline, but the feeling was true. He had treated me like a turn, a chapter. I was determined to be the whole book. My whole book. It's April now. April 13th, 2025. The air here doesn't smell like the city. It smells like damp earth and pine needles. I'm not in Brooklyn anymore. With the settlement money, I bought a small cabin nestled in the mountains. This morning, I watched the sun come up, a splash of orange and pink over the silent peaks. My dog is asleep at my feet. There's a new fountain pen on the rough-hewn wooden table beside me, filled with a deep forest green ink, the color of new growth. I'm drafting plans for a small extension, a studio with a glass wall facing the sunrise. I learned that you can't renovate a structure with a rotten foundation. You can't just patch the cracks and repaint the walls and pretend it's sound. Sometimes, you have to have the courage to light the match, walk away, and build something new and true from the ground up on solid land. This new life is quiet. But it's a peaceful quiet, not a heavy one. It's the quiet of strength, not of fear. If life twists again, I'll be here to share. What would you have done? Peace tastes like cold ink.